A Cricketing View, an irregular podcast about cricket and other things. Episode 3. My guests today are Freddie Wilde and Tim Wigmore, authors of the new book Cricket 2.0. In this conversation, we survey what they learned writing the book, the past, present, and potential futures of T20 cricket. Welcome, Freddie. Welcome, Tim.
Hi.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much for having us on the pod. Excited to have a chat.
I read the book over the weekend. I enjoyed it very much. I wanted to talk to you about T20 because even though it has grown so much, there haven't really been that many book-length treatments of this new sport. You guys have broken some ground in this book, and I thought it would be nice to have a conversation about, what you guys found and what you guys learned and your experience of working on the book.
Sure, that'd be great. I mean, one of the reasons we wrote the book was because we often found ourselves looking for a book about the topics we were interested in, and we realised that there wasn't a book out there, so we thought we'd write one ourselves.
Yeah, I suppose the best reason to write a book, isn't it, is to write the book you wanted to read, and that was very much our experience in doing this. And we first actually got seriously talking about this early in 2017. So actually, 2.5, almost three years ago now. It was a slightly winding road to get from there to here, but it's been rewarding, and we've kind of learned a lot along the way. And it actually feels, even the time we've been doing the book, the need for it's become a lot more pressing. So I suppose 2017, T20 still wasn't being taken that seriously, although I think the World Cup in 2016 was the first time it began to be kind of looked at from a kind of tactical, strategic lens in quite a common way. But even within the process of writing this book, there's been a big evolution in terms of the stuff that we talk about. Some of that is sort of seeping into the popular discourse on T20, at least to a degree. So we hope that it kind of reflects that, and also encourages people to look a bit more deeply as well, and also to sort of see that this format, that it still can be very easy and very lazy to ride as a slogathon, to just see it's got see the nuance and what's really going on there, because it is ultimately, it's, for all the razzmatazz has, it's a very serious professional sport with a lot of money in it and really, really strong incentives to win, and people who are giving a lot of thought to how to win and how to get an edge, and that's what we've sort of tried to explore in the book.
The competitiveness of the 20-over game has sort of taken over how T20 is discussed. It has become about the competitiveness of the contest rather than the stardom of the participant. This shift began sometime in that period, after 2012, because in your book also you have this fun section where you point out that at one point Sourav Ganguly could no longer get a contract in an auction. Nobody wanted him, right?
Yeah. I mean, that moment, we sort of, I mean, there are probably a number of moments in the history of T20 or in the history of the IPL when you could probably pinpoint and say, it began to become more serious. So at auctions in particular, certain players going unsold, or certain matches even, you might be able to pinpoint and say, wow, this is suddenly a very serious contest. And the one that we chose, it wasn't sort of necessarily the pivot point, but we looked at the auction when Ganguly went unsold at KKR, and how when the IPL began, as you said, it was very much about celebrity, and it's sort of the early auctions had a sort of feeling of basically rich people picking their favourite cricketers rather than teams trying to assemble a set of players to win the tournament. And Ganguly going unsold when he did marked a shift, I think, in the way that teams approach the auction, and KKR were at the vanguard of that change. I mean, Rajasthan Royals were the first team to win the tournament, and they adopted a sort of Moneyball style approach to the auction. But KKR sort of doubled down on that and formed probably, along with Chennai, one of the first dynasties of the IPL. We tell the story of that in one of the chapters. Venki Mysore is a businessman who was from America, who came over and basically took charge of KKR, and by applying rigorous analytics to the team building and to the auction, KKR started to become a very successful team after struggling in the early years, and you're right, that change happened in that around 2010 to 11-12. That sort of period is when the IPL begun to shift, and I think nowadays the large majority of teams in the tournament are run in a very professional manner, or certainly far more professionally than they were in 2008.
And just with the Ganguly, when he's not picked up, there's a lot of articles. People really think that Kolkata fans will stop going because they he's their sort of local prince, and they think that this guy, even though he's not actually very good at the sport anymore, certainly at this specific sport, rather than cricket more broadly, he's such a big draw that it doesn't really matter how he plays, but he will put bums on seats and so on. And in the end, basically, Kolkata, they make a gamble that what matters, their bet is what matters more than razzmatazz is actually winning. And so the season after Ganguly goes, the first time they get to the playoff for the first time, and they also become the first IPL team to record a profit. And then they sort of learn through that example that winning, it's a winning that can actually make a franchise more profitable, more than just getting stars for the sake of it. And I'm not saying that journey is complete, because clearly if you get Chris Gale, that does open up opens up certain extra value in terms of advertising and marketing and so on, and sort of sponsors you'll get involved. But it's a pretty decisive point in the IPL going on that journey. And I don't think that journey is complete yet, but it's advanced a heck of a long way since 2008, and even really since early 2010s.
It's interesting that you bring up Rajasthan Royals. I remember I interviewed Zubin Bharucha, who used to work for them, I think it was like 6-7 years ago, and we exchanged emails. And one of the things he insisted, and he was very very insistent on, was that the Rajasthan Royals coaching at the time was concerned with, in his words, producing cricketers for India. And he was sort of very very clear that this was a new venue to produce cricketers, to train young players, basically. Pursuing this line of, this question about identity, about how it goes from celebrity to competitiveness. Does that shift in competitiveness also sort of entail a much more focused preparation for T20, rather than broadly trying to improve players?
I think so. I think this is a shift which is still occurring, more so than the sort of shift to it being taken seriously. I think, for example, let's say you've got someone like Rahul Dravid, who has actually worked at Rajasthan. He's now working with young players in India. If he was working at an IPL team, there would be, I think there would be when he's training a young batsman, let's say Sanju Samson, during the IPL season, I'm sure they would also discuss other formats of cricket and how you might improve as a test player and a one-day player, because someone like Rahul Dravid is invested in the Indian game as a whole. And that's completely understandable, and that's never going to completely go away, I don't think. But I think as the game becomes more and more serious and is taken more and more seriously, and winning, as Tim says, becomes more related to profit and the general success of the franchise, then I think that the sort of focus on multi-format skills will diminish over time. I don't think it'll ever go completely, but ultimately, the coach will be employed by Rajasthan Royals or whichever team we're talking about, and his job will be to make sure that team wins IPL matches, not necessarily produce players for India or whoever, or improve the Red Bull skills of the players that he's working with. And I think that as that becomes more and more over time, then we'll see a sort of a specialization of talent and a specialization of coaching that is focused more and more on T20 rather than on, as I said, multi-format skills.
And actually on that, one of, I think, our favorite interviews in the book was we talked with Rahul Dravid, and it was so interesting to get an insight from obviously legend of the Test game into T20, and he's such a deep thinker about T20. And one of the things we talked to him about was fielding, actually. And there was this idea when T20 comes along that fielding this kind of undervalued thing that will become more and more important. And of course, the standards got a lot better. But he sort of explains why actually maybe fielding sometimes can be overvalued as opposed to undervalued, simply because fielding. To focus on fielding is focused on marginal gains, but of course, if you can just hit more balls out the ground, who needs the marginal gains? And as he said, I don't care how good a fielder he is, he's not going to save 18 runs in a T20 game. So if you pick a bowler who's a better fielder and a less good bowler, well, they could save you a few runs and cost you far more. But just the fact that he's thought about that almost quite marginal thing and such a deep level is actually emblematic of the level of thought that's going on in T20. And I think where T20 has differed from other sports actually is that the sort of level of conversation happening within teams has been far more advanced than that happening, in the media and so on. So there's a bit of a disconnect in terms of how fans view what's happening and what's really going on. And again, in the book, through talking to all these people, we're hoping to bridge that gap a little bit and help illuminate readers into how this game is really, really played now, because often we still see it through quite a superficial lens, I think.
Well, one of the things you notice also is that there's a lot of second tier T20 emerging in recent times, like the Karnataka Premier League and the Tamil Nadu Premier League, and then outside of the major, like you have the Pakistan Super League, but you also have domestic T20 in both Pakistan and India, and you have, of course, now England has had a massive T20 tournament since 2003. There have been 16 of those right now, right? 16 or 17.
Yeah. 17, yeah.
There seems to be a critical mass developing whereby the sport can stand on its own. Is that something that administrators are pursuing, or is that sort of being driven by the market?
I think it's being driven by both. Like T20 is the most popular format of cricket, which is why all these leagues are popping up. But so far, the story has probably been more of stumbling kind of from one league to the next, and a kind of a lack of overarching plan. And one of the things that we go into actually is the idea that lots of leagues are losing money. And the reason they are is because everyone looks at the IPL and is so jealous and wants to create their own mini IPL. And by doing that, they massively overestimate the desire in India to watch foreign cricket, basically, to watch leagues which really don't have any Indian players because of the BCCI's ban on Indian players going overseas. And that's why we've seen some leagues like the Global League in South Africa, the Euroslam was cancelled, the Euroslam has been postponed, and who knows if it'll come back. There's been some issues in Canada as well with players being paid late. And so you have this odd thing where everyone is possibly being a little bit too ambitious. There's certainly, my argument is that there's certainly scope for a lot of T20 leagues to be viable, but I don't think there's necessarily scope for them to be viable in their current guise. And you have, sometimes you have an arms race in terms of how much they're spending on overseas players and stuff, and that hasn't really added up. And actually, even the last few months, we've seen some pretty major leagues like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Australia's Big Bash as well. They're all reducing the amount they're spending on salaries, because although those leagues are very popular, they haven't been able to make the sums quite add up as, say, the IPL has.
No, the reason I asked about second-tier leagues is that, there's this big story, Freddie, about Jasprit Bumrah, and how he was spotted by Mr. Wright when he was employed by the Indians. I mean, the Mumbai Indians.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that's always struck me about that story was that, he spotted him playing in a local tournament. And then, fine, he spots him. He says, okay, here's a potential player. And so, I mean, the Gujarat Association has also probably spotted him. And what happens then is that all the preparatory cricket, all the second lower level cricket that Jasprit Bumrah actually ends up playing is age group cricket organized by the Gujarat board and then the Indian board. The IPL team seem to sort of do a lot of scouting, but they don't seem to have any place where they can do anything about that scouting. For any sort of actual development, they're completely dependent on the BCCI's admittedly vast system.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. But I think it will. I would say, I would guess that over time, we will see teams sort of that the tentacles of these teams will stretch deeper into the system itself. And I would like to think and hope, and I think it would benefit teams if they did this, if they were to, if the Mumbai Indians, to take your example, was to, to sort of to work with the state association and to do their own talent scouting and sort of funding, I suppose, of that level of cricket below the IPL. Because I think what you're sort of getting at a little bit is that, is that the IPL teams almost can reap the rewards of work done elsewhere, and are dependent still upon as you said, the BCCI system and the work that the state associations have done. But I think that if I was running an IPL team or a team in any league, I think it would make sense for you to try and embed yourself more deeply in the local game. I think we're seeing it a little bit more in the PSL as well, actually. I know that Lahore, Qalandars and Peshawar Zalmi do a lot of, they organise a lot of tournaments themselves at a local level. So they're essentially getting in at that grassroots level, which you're sort of referring to, and actually organise tournaments. And then they've got scouts at those tournaments and talent hunt programs. And I think last year Lahore signed a guy that they picked up from one of the tournaments that they'd arranged. And I think over time we'll see that happen more and more. I think the Big Bash teams do it too. Because ultimately, as Tim referred to with KKR, we're finding that teams that win on the pitch generally win off it. And I think that simply means that, teams will continue to be run more professionally and more rigorously. And that will involve, I hope, sort of them winding themselves into the state system and the infrastructure of the game at a lower level.
Right now...
And sorry, if I could just, to me, the really exciting thing is if you think of the IPL as a domestic league, but also a global league, which it clearly is. So it's sort of the NBA of cricket, I always call it. And if you look at what the NBA's done on a talent level in recent years, so they've built academies in Australia, China, India, Mexico, and Senegal, which are funded essentially by the league themselves. And this would be an amazing, really interesting step, and it would make sense actually for the IPL if they were to put academies in, say, Nepal, in USA, in Canada, in African country, and so on. And so the IPL becomes sort of the way in which talent is developed around the world. That is certainly one possibility, and sort of linked to that, similar to what US sports have, they have basically farm leagues. So they have each team, each major franchise will have a lot of players, far more than they can ever fit into their main squad, and they will put them into different tiers. And the really interesting thing actually would be, let's say the IPL league like the Euroslam, which is obviously going to be, we talked about tiers of league, that will be probably a third tier league realistically. Imagine if the IPL were to buy that league and to say, we're going to sort of take over the running of this. And as part of this, we're going to put, say, 3 Indian under-23 players, so the sort of squad peripheral players from the IPL teams. We're going to put 3 Indian under-23 players in each franchise. Well, that would be an incredible step. It would be actually good for the development of cricket around the world. It would be good for the IPL's imprint, and it would also be a good way of developing those young cricketers. And I think sometimes that's an IPL problem, that you have these 25-man squads, and often you don't have a huge amount of game time, and then suddenly you have next season. I think one of the steps, again, is, which we begin to see with teams like KKR, is these guys they're big assets, and winning is worth a lot, but not enough is done in the 9.5 months between each IPL season. So again, some of those steps as a way of sort of centrally controlling them, the players to a degree, what happens in between IPLs, that would be a really interesting step, and it would probably benefit the franchises and the players alike.
I think the question of control is an interesting one, because it's not that the IPL does not contribute, right? The IPL is ultimately, the IPL belongs to the BCCI, and every year some of the money is paid up to the BCCI. And the BCCI uses some of that money to pay for all the age group and everything like that. So the IPL does contribute to it. And then I think the question of control comes in, because, one of the risks of IPL franchises building this sort of almost rival infrastructure to the BCCI is it will sort of change the balance of power between the BCCI and the IPL potentially. I mean, that's sort of one of the things that they will have to work through, I suppose, in this decade. Do you think there's any chance of this growth abating anytime soon? I mean, the expansion in 2023 is almost a foregone conclusion, right? It's going to happen.
Yeah, we talk about that. Yeah, we talk about that in the book. We sort of get, I think, the inside story on how the IPL is likely to expand. So that's likely to be from 8 teams to 10, and an increase from a minimum of 10 days to potentially 2 or 3 weeks. So that will put further stresses on the calendar. At the moment, there's no evidence that interest in the IPL is waning. It's quite the opposite. And of course, as the Indian economy continues to grow, that will mean the IPL can become a lot more lucrative, because the amount of money in broadcasting, advertising, and so on will increase. And that's another thing that separates the direction of. It's not only starting from a much bigger place than, say, even the Big Bash, but also its trajectory is different. In terms of the sources of revenue growth are a lot more obvious. So it would be a surprise the IPL does not expand, not just in teams and games, but in days as well.
I mean, you were saying that other leagues have been trying to mimic the IPL to sort of use the IPL model for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any sort of attempt to produce some alternative type of model
I think that the CPL is probably quite an interesting case study in this, because I think a couple of seasons ago, the market in the Caribbean is not particularly large, and I think that what the Caribbean Premier League did a few years ago was they essentially moved their games earlier in the day because they wanted to try and suit an Indian TV market, and they found that by doing so, firstly, there still wasn't that much interest in India in the CPL itself, because ultimately these weren't teams that they could relate to particularly. And then also what happened was that the people in the Caribbean stopped going because it was in the middle of the day and it didn't suit their working hours. And so the CPL then adjusted and moved back to playing matches in the evening and essentially trying to nurture a local fan base and, I think, tap into the American interest in cricket. And there's a very large expat population in America, and I think that there was a sort of a realization that what they could do was build a market around the Caribbean and the USA rather than trying to pander, I suppose, to the Indian market. And I think we've seen now, particularly in Guyana and Trinidad, amazing fan bases have been built up. Really loyal followers of the game. If you watch a match being played at either of those two home stadiums, the crowd and the atmosphere is remarkable. And I think you've seen there that essentially the benefits of a league focusing on the local market and trying to nurture fans in the stadium, and I think that creates ultimately a better feel around the tournament. And of course, ultimately you still need the TV revenue and the interest in the TV broadcast is what's going to really drive the league, because that's where the money is. But the product for TV looks significantly better when you have full stadiums and excellent atmospheres. And I think the CPL is a really good example of how a league, by focusing on its local market, can grow. And the CPL is never going to make huge money, I wouldn't imagine, but it's staying. It's a successful league. It's managing to sign high profile overseas players, and it appears to be sustainable, at least in the short term.
Yeah, well, the CPL, they lost money for, I think it took them until the 6th year to go into the black for the first time this season, but they now seem to have found a model that works for them. And again, what they've identified absolutely crucial. Every year you get a couple of new guys who emerge as local stars. So this year we've seen Brandon King and Hayden Walsh Jr. They've both basically gone from nowhere to being in the West Indies squad, thanks to playing brilliantly in the CPL. And these new stars are such an important part of the CPL. And one clever thing they did, recognising that, was for this season they moved the overseas players allowed in the 11 from 5 down to 4, because they basically said, rather than having a kind of, say, a Kiwi or someone who's a solid cricketer but not actually an A-lister, otherwise he'd have been picked earlier, we would rather that slot was taken by a young kid from Ghana or Trinidad, because actually for our audience their story is more captivating. And I think that's the right approach for that league. And they've got through some difficulties and they've kind of stumbled across a formula that it's sensible and it works for that market.
Do you foresee an American CPL franchises in the future?
Well, so that their long ambition has been to have an 8-team CPL with a team in Toronto and a team in probably either New York or Florida. That's been their sort of long-term ambition, but there's a lot of difficulties getting cricket off the ground in the US. It also adds quite a lot in the way of costs of transport and so on, obviously, which is a real thing for these leagues. I know we don't really think about that, and but the costs of it all are a big thing. So I think, I think that the odds are that will happen at some point, but it might be alternatively that you take a smaller franchise and you relocate them to the US, or they split. There's different options. I do think the lesson from so many leagues, you expand too fast, too quickly.
Yeah, I was about to say exactly.
Your own back.
I was about to say exactly that. I mean, I think the IPL is a good example of that. Obviously, it did expand and then it moved back. And I remember after Chennai and Rajasthan were banned and then returned, I remember talking to a number of people and saying, like, surely this is the perfect time for the IPL to expand, because they've introduced 2 new teams, which are Gujarat and Pune. And if they could have added Chennai and Rajasthan to it, then there would have been a sort of natural growth towards 10 teams. But even then, the BCCI essentially said, no, you know what, we're going to wait. I don't think anyone really seriously thinks the IPL isn't going to expand, but it didn't happen then. And they basically said, look, we're going to keep our powder dry on this expansion. We're going to make sure we've really got this strong foundation of these 8 teams, which will have been around for 10 plus years, and then we'll make the move into an expansion. And if the IPL does that, I think that's a lesson to leagues around the world. And I think we saw last year it wasn't catastrophic, but the Big Bash tried to expand and it probably didn't quite get it right, and it's now having to adjust this year. We'll have to see what happens, but expansion is not as easy as I think it's made out to be. It's not like, okay, so this league's really popular, we can make it bigger, we can grow. I think you need to it needs to happen over a longer period of time, so that the teams that do exist are very much established before that expansion happens. The PSL still has 6 teams. That's been really popular and has been really successful. I don't think that they should expand anytime soon either. They should continue to nurture those 6 teams they've got.
And in terms of the viability of these leagues and where you can make some serious money, one of the possibilities is you go from having national leagues to regional leagues. So if you had, say, the PSL were to merge with the Bangladesh Premier League, you could then have 8 or 10 teams, or even 2 divisions, who knows, and still a really high standard and proven fan bases and proven teams. The IPL has no need to do that, but for other leagues, that's an interesting model. And it does create difficulties as well in terms of transport, and are people going to see the value of local rivalries being diluted if you're seeing teams from different countries and so on. But that, I think, for those sort of tier 2 leagues, that's something to consider. And the other thing as well, the CPL, they've had a lot of talks with other countries like Singapore, Hong Kong and so on, about playing a few games there, and that's another interesting model. And I suppose maybe the elephant in the room is the Champions League, which actually in our book we talk about the incredible importance of the Champions League in the story of Trinidad and Tobago, and therefore in the West Indies, and how they built the first dynasty, really, international T20 cricket. But obviously that stopped running in 2014, basically because Mumbai didn't get in, and the Indian fans had a lack of appetite to watch Otago Vaults, and that created that created problems. But as T20 goes to the next level, and obviously there's the real problem about players playing for multiple teams, but I think there's a lot to be said for Champions League, and a lot of the owners we talked to, including from the IPL, were keen on the Champions League returning. We felt it needed some tweaks from its previous iterations, but that would be an interesting model, because actually we see Ghana now. I know they didn't win the CPL, but as they're winning those 11 games in a row, I remember talking to Freddie, one of our kind of nerdy conversations, and we had a kind of interesting hypothetical chat about where they'd come in the IPL and whether the best domestic team in the world beyond IPL teams. And that's interesting, as it becomes more of a serious sport, people want to know the answers to those questions. So the Champions League would help a lot.
I've noticed one model the Australians have tried it, which is to sort of try and have the WBBL and the BBL close together. Often they would have the women's game and then followed by the men's game on the same day. They say that this is sort of to give a boost to the women's game, which is a separate sport in its own right and has its own standing and its own identity. But is there also a reverse effect that it's possibly aimed at bringing new audiences and additional audiences to the men's game, especially given how much emphasis there has been from Australian administrators on saying, oh well, it's a family sport, we want it to be a family sport for family audiences and so on and so forth?
I mean, I think that there is something to be said for that, and the Big Bash has done that quite well. I mean, the Big Bash used to run the women's and men's tournaments concurrently. They now don't do that. The Women's Big Bash, well, this year certainly is going to happen. I think there's a little bit of an overlap, but essentially the Women's Big Bash will be played largely before the Men's Big Bash. But if you were to go onto the website of, let's say, the Melbourne Renegades and just click on players, they will just show you the men's and the women's players in one page. You can obviously then filter it and just look at the men's or just look at the women's. But there's a concerted effort there to present them as one thing, and I think you're seeing now with the 100 in over here in the UK, which is obviously being launched at the moment, and this first season will be next year. We're seeing the same thing again. We had the icon players, they're called, unveiled last week, and the men and women essentially were announced together and presented together, and you'll see now on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook it's very much about both the men's and the women's team rather than one. And the tournaments may well run separately, or matches might not necessarily be one after the other, but I think presenting them as one thing, it has definite value, and certainly in attracting more women to follow the game.
As T20 sort of acquires its own competitive identity, and also it already has its own corporate identity, right? But from a competitive standpoint, it is a very short contest, so the effect of sort of individual flukes is proportionately larger compared to, say, a 100-over game or a 4-day game or whatever, right? So is there a case for turning it into a high volume contest along the lines of Major League Baseball?
Yeah, absolutely. I wrote an article a couple of years ago, I think for CricBuzz, where I discussed this, and I think there's a formula by a guy who works in baseball, essentially looking at trying to work out how much luck influences games in different sports, and I think I can't remember the exact number, but the conclusion of the analysis that I did on T20 was that you'd need to play, I think off the top of my head, I can't remember exactly, I have to dig the article out, was about 70 matches per league stage would be required for you to be confident in the fact that the points table would reflect the quality of the teams. Now, 70 is a huge increase on what we currently have.
They would have to play every day, right?
But yeah, sure. But you look at other leagues, American sports. I think you might know better than me that I think that's something. Is it baseball has 150 plus games?
Yeah, 162.
162. Yeah, and so
NBA has 82 games.
Yeah, so that kind of volume of matches is not completely alien to domestic sports. I think in cricket, because we're used to these T20 leagues being pop-up leagues that exist for 6 to 8 weeks, sometimes only even 4 weeks. We imagine teams playing 8 games, 10 games, 14 games. 16 seems like a lot when we had that in the IPL, but actually it's not. And as you said, you rightly pointed out, there is a huge amount of luck involved in a T20 contest. As you shorten the game, that naturally happens. And if you are, I think it would, from a sort of sporting perspective, you would be far more confident that good teams were winning if you played, if the league stage was longer. I think recently in the IPL, the last couple of IPL seasons, in fact, have been very, very tight, and the difference between the team finishing 4th and the team finishing 7th has been sometimes a win or maybe even just net run rate. And I think this is a really important discussion, actually, and something I'm quite passionate about, because essentially, as the sport tries to evolve from a sporting perspective, who wins is really important. So teams that are successful will drive evolution forward in terms of how the game is approached, how it's played, the tactics and strategies that shape the game. And at the moment in T20, I think there's in a way it's being slightly held back because because of the luck involved and because of the fact that leagues aren't particularly long, sometimes we'll find that teams who don't deserve to win, in inverted commas, end up winning. And I think, the CPL this year was a really good example. Guyana won 11 games in a row, one of the great streaks in T20 cricket, and they didn't end up lifting the trophy. And I think people will recognise that they were a very good side. But let's say next year they don't reach the playoffs. Johan Botha, the head coach, might let's just say that he
loses his job.
He loses his job, exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas he has there, in this season alone, and I think in the last few seasons as well, they've often been runners up in the CPL. He's creating quite clearly a successful model for a successful team, and ultimately it would be better for the game if teams like Guyana ended up lifting the trophy. You're always going to have the chance, especially in finals, of one-off games of teams of really successful teams or very good teams not winning. But that's a debate as well to have about how finals should be structured, and in the CPL
whether there should be finals.
Well, certain, yeah. I think that realistically, in the modern world, given the way things are structured, you're going to have them. But I think you can put things in place to ensure that the best team is at an advantage. One thing that they don't do in the CPL, which I think they should do, is have home advantage. So if you finish first, you should play the finals matches should be played at your venue. And for Guyana, that would have been really significant because they've built their success around being good at home. You could maybe even play a final series of 3 matches potentially. So there are lots of things you can do, but I think that is the role of luck in T20 is something that we don't talk about enough, and I think we should talk about more for that reason.
It seems to me that there's a convergence from the competitive standpoint. You need to play more games to have a better quality competition. Right, as in a competition which will actually produce a reliable winner, so to speak. Mm-hmm. From a television standpoint, if they can show Virat Kohli 40 times a year or 50 times a year, that would be, better than showing him 14 times. What I'm wondering is what are the directions in which this new identity, which has begun to be established in the last 4 or 5 years, is most likely to take shape within the next decade, which was when I think things will begin to get settled a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think it will probably. You say it will get settled. I don't think it will get settled within the next 10 years. I think the IPL will. Well, I think we talk about this in the book. The IPL is almost certain to grow to 10 teams, and as Tim said, it will become a slightly longer league. And then I think, again, this is a little bit of looking into the crystal ball and having a guess, but the way that I see it going is I think that in 10 years' time, we'll have a discussion about the IPL becoming 12 teams. And then maybe 5 years after that, we might have a conversation about an IPL Division 2. And I think, there might be a point, in fact, when it becomes, things start to move quicker than that. But for me, I only see one direction of growth, which is T20 cricket and the IPL, and that might be other divisions of the IPL, but essentially city-based domestic cricket with private ownership of those teams becoming more and more significant in India. And most probably that leads towards a bit more of an Americanization of cricket. This is I don't know necessarily if Tim would agree with me here, but this is my way of I see it going. Mm-hmm. And in years to come, we might be talking 25 years about a 6-month long Indian T20 season, and there might be 2 or 3 divisions in that season, and how the rest of the world adapts to that will remain to be seen. And I definitely am not as confident predicting that side of things.
Well, it might be that we get almost like we have with basketball. So we have the NBA, we have the IPL, like the NBA is the pinnacle at the top, and then the Big Bash and even the 100 and all the other leagues are basically they're lower divisions of the IPL. So it might be that's where you send your fringe players to play, and if they're good, they get promoted from the Brisbane Knight Riders, as they'll be by then, to Kolkata Knight Riders. It's all possible. It is interesting. I mean, there's so many possibilities, and actually the IPL has probably been more cautious. More cautious than many would have expected so far. But I don't think that's going to last.
Tim, it's interesting. Sorry, just to jump in very briefly with your reference there to the Brisbane Knight Riders. One other potential development, and this would be slightly, I mean, it could also happen at the same time as the situation I was just talking about with the 6-month T20 calendar in India. But you could also see more teams like KKR have got TKR. They could also invest in a team in Australia and in England. And this is where the Champions League idea might be able to come back. And I would love this to happen personally. I think it would be really cool, and it could work if we had essentially, that there might be 8, 9, 10 teams around the world, not just the Knight Riders, but you'd have, the London Super Kings or whatever it might be. And those teams who are sort of centrally owned, if you like, share players. There's a core set of players who play for TKR and KKR and whoever it may be. And then you could have teams competing with one another because those players are sort of are linked purely to that one umbrella team, if you like, and you could see something happen there. But the reason I would say that that's unlikely is that simply the strength of the Indian market and the Indian game is so much that I just don't see other leagues being able to compete. As we said, I think that we've seen the Knight Riders invest in the Trinbago team, and that is working to a degree. But I think ultimately they would, I haven't got access to their balance sheets, but I would say that their best bet of making more money is with KKR and is with the IPL. So I see that the IPL simply being more dominant in that regard.
Yeah, as I was saying, and then you use your other team. You can make a loss on your other teams, but that is your development. That is your player development. So it doesn't matter if you're losing money owning Brisbane Knight Riders or KKR, because that's the cost that you are paying to develop your players and improve and be more likely to win the one that really, really matters, which is the IPL.
That's sort of almost like the Manchester City model, right? Where
it is, yeah. Yeah, we talked about that. I actually visited the club in Melbourne. I was in Australia a couple of years ago, and in the end of the book, we do talk about the comparison between Kolkata Knight Riders and Man City, and there are some big comparisons in terms of the sharing of information, and this is becoming. You talked earlier about the number of games of T20, so there was 720 last year. So it's not yet a football level, but you need it. Absolutely, you need a proper staff to analyse that, to sift through that all, to look at trends, to identify players and stuff. And that's where knowledge sharing and having an umbrella of teams, it really makes a great deal of sense. And actually, if you look at Kolkata, I know I said it's Kolkata Knight Riders that make the money, but since they've taken over ownership of Trinbago, they've been extremely successful. So that model has worked on both a commercial level and a sporting level for them. I'm actually a little bit surprised that we haven't seen other teams pursuing that model, because it does seem novice one in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I mean, that sort of it seems to me that T20 has to grow in order to survive, and these are all sort of what you're describing are all potential directions. There are at least some hints about in the current situation about where teams and franchises are considering expansion and in what ways. Speaking of which, I'm very glad you brought up the 100. What is this beast? I mean, it seems to be a much derided, in many ways, this is kind of an inexplicable beast. I mean, what are they trying to achieve?
I think it's very explicable. I personally think in England we've had the debate about how England should run its T20 tournament, or its flagship short form tournament, maybe I should call it, has raged for a long time. We've obviously had 18 counties, and once the IPL, and that was the original T20 tournament in 2003. The IPL then came along with its 8-team tournament. And as we've talked about, the most important thing with the IPL was the fact that one game was on per day, or 2 at the weekend, and essentially every game was televised, and that essentially transformed the model for T20 leagues. And the difficulty in England, whereas in Australia and the Caribbean and Pakistan and South Africa to a lesser extent, and New Zealand, they were able to establish similar copycat leagues whereby there were enough teams, or few enough teams rather, for you to televise one game a day. The trouble being in England, there were too many teams, there were 18 teams, and actually creating a tournament that had as I said, 8 to 10 teams, enough teams to have a game every day was very difficult, and the counties held the votes. And so we've always had a tension in England about how we're going to create this, the modern style T20 tournament. And I think, personally, my interpretation of how it's come about is I think that the ECB thought, well, if the counties aren't going to vote for a T20 competition, how about we try a 100-ball one? It's just something different, essentially. And the counties then have said, well, okay, so hang on, we can still keep our T20 tournament, and you can, and you're, a change was coming, and change was inevitable. And I think that what the ECB have done by creating this tournament is basically managed to wriggle away from the 18 county system, and they've created this new format. And I think there are genuine benefits, I think, to the 100-ball game. I think that there is a sort of simplicity that we'll see, I think, when the 100-ball format starts, with very much a sort of 100-ball counter going down on one side and the runs going up on the other. And then in the second innings, you'll have the opposite, where the runs are being chased and the 100 balls will go down. And that's quite a sort of, it is essentially a rebranding of a game, which it's not that different, and it won't be that different. But I think for me, I see it as a bit of a political play. And I think that's why we've got it. I don't think it will be that radically different to T20 as a game. It will obviously have differences. But that's, for me, that's the explanation that I see as to why this has happened as it has.
No, I think that's a very good explanation. It does make a lot of sense, but in a sense, I mean, the counties have gotten played in exchange for some money, basically, which, I mean, the ECB is probably committing to share some of the money with the counties, right? Yeah,
they are. They will. And I mean, I think you say played, and I think in a way you could look at it like that. But I think almost they had no choice. The way the game has been going, the counties have been resisting change for so long. It's been a real sticking point in the English game for a long time now. And I think that essentially they thought, right, this is we're going to have to go with this as an option, which means we might be able to keep our tournament alive. And I think I think the T20 Blast, people are thinking the T20 Blast is going to suffer massively. It probably will, to a degree, because the existing T20 tournament is going to be played earlier in the year. But players will see that as a feeder to the 100, and we see this with T20 tournaments in India. They've got the Side Mushtaq Ali, which is obviously the state tournament, and then feeds through to the IPL.
That's an enormous tournament.
Yeah, a huge tournament, and people's interest in the Side Mushtaq Ali tournament has grown because they're now aware that players who do well in that will do well in the IPL. And I don't know. I doubt that that tournament is sort of commercially viable in of itself. But there is, it fits into a broader system, and I see the Blast doing that as well over here in England.
From what you guys are saying, it seems to me that the major insight about T20, which the IPL has produced, is that you have to offer the public a little bit less than what they might expect. Is that a fair sort of reading?
I think you need to make a narrative that's easy to understand, and you can't have a narrative if you start and there's so many teams. I mean, people talk about the Premier League with 20 teams. In football, well, in most countries, cricket is not as popular as football, and it's difficult introducing a new competition, having loads of teams, loads of players at once. So I think the secret is element of you concentrate the talent, you concentrate the stories, and then you have that sort of pub talk. I think the problem with the T20 Blast in England has been is that even amongst cricket fans, everyone's experience of the T20 Blast is so different. So if I'm my local team is Surrey, but if if my friend's local team is Somerset, even though we're in the same kind of pool, north and south, we'll actually rarely watch games at the same time and so on. We'll rarely, we won't even know. And I think the danger of T20 Blast, it's hard to know. Each year, we talk about breakout stars in the CPL and the IPL. Well, there's breakout stars every year in the T20 Blast, but they can be a bit hard to uncover and to kind of convey because there's so many games, and that narrative gets diluted, it gets confusing. Personally, I think I would like, in terms of raising the standard and so on, I would really like, and maybe the IPL will be the one that does it because it's got the size to, you introduce what's worked so well for the Premier League, which is relegation and promotion and relegation. So if you had two leagues of 8 or something, with one team going down, and maybe you have in the Division 1 you're allowed to say 2 overseas players or whatever, that would be a brutal that would be brutal, and we'd have the drama at the bottom end as well as the top end. So that's one possibility. But I guess if leagues are very short, with 8 teams going to 4 to the playoffs, generally most teams are in it for most of the tournament.
I always think about baseball when I think about how cricket is growing and developing, and baseball basically came about in the era before television and actually even before radio. And teams used to basically, they had to play more games if they had to make more money, because the audience was limited to whoever could be fit into the ground, could be persuaded to buy a ticket. And so I think that was sort of probably one of the reasons why it became such a high volume sport. I think coincidentally, it also worked out in a competitive sense. But cricket, T20 especially, is definitely a television sport, isn't it? I mean, it's played in prime time. It's organized for television.
Yeah, I mean, it's the product of its generation, as you said, with regards to baseball. It's evolved differently, and that's why it will be really interesting to see how the IPL does go about its expansion. And one thing that's also sort of on the flip side, I suppose, football over here in the UK, or soccer, is similar to baseball in that it started very much as a spectator sport and it's grown. And what we're seeing now actually in the Premier League is there are more matches played on. We now have Friday night football. We never really had that.
Monday
so
nights.
Now we have Monday night football too, and matches are played increasingly. Matches are not played concurrently. There's sometimes on a Saturday, I think sometimes you can have as far as 4 Premier League matches at the same time, sometimes maybe even 3. Whereas you used to have an entire program of games, and that's simply because there's pressure from we now have 2 TV companies in the UK who bid for football rights, BT and Sky. There are pressure from the TV broadcasters to have more games, so they can show more games on TV, and as a result, that's almost going the inverse of how we're imagining IPL expansion going. We're saying, games might be played more concurrently. Actually, I think, as I said earlier, I think the IPL will look to try and avoid that, because ultimately Star and the guys who own the rights to the TV, to the broadcasting rights to the IPL are the guys who call the shots. They're the most powerful people in cricket. And they won't want matches to be played simultaneously, because it means that they can't televise them both on one of their channels. People can't watch them both at the same time.
Tim, you were saying something?
No, I think, I agree with that. It's interesting that the Premier League actually, a new broadcasting deal for the first time, over half of all matches will be televised. So that traditional model, it started out you only have 1 or 2 games every week televised. Now you have 5 every weekend, sometimes 6 televised. So leagues now, they make their money from broadcasting. They don't really make a very small proportion from in-house. People actually coming to the games. I think that will remain true for the IPL as well. And there's different ways it could go. I mean, we talked about it before. I guess it's just you have those extra games, they bring value. But if you're playing it at 3 or 4 p.m. on a Wednesday, does that not give off the look you want to as well? So it's that balance, but. Yeah, I mean, the direction of travel, there will be growth. It's a question of actually whether the rest of cricket can deal with it and can accommodate it. From the IPL's point of view, that's not really their problem.
How does international T20 fit into all this? I mean, because it is that thing, international T20 sort of operates on pretty much exactly the same model as international Test cricket and international ODIs, right? It's part of a tour. And then there's the ICC World Tournament. There isn't even that many triangular internationals or anything like that, the way there used to be one-day triangulars and quadrilaterals. What is the status of that? What is the future of that, do you think?
I think how international T20s are played outside of ICC events remains to be seen. But I think one thing we can be sure of is that the T20 World Cup will grow in terms of the number of teams that play in it. I think we're already seeing that begin to happen. It's sort of a half-botched format. But I see more teams playing at T20 international level, and I see the T20 World Cup itself becoming a bigger and bigger thing. I wouldn't be surprised if within the next 10 to 15 years, the T20 World Cup is a larger and bigger event, sort of in terms of its reputation, than the 50 over World Cup, which is, I think, considered is still considered the sort of the event or the ICC event. But I think that will change very quickly. I think, in fact, so we've got the World Cup in Australia next year. I think the one after that is meant to be in India. I can see that being a huge event. And I think that is fairly certain that the World Cup itself will become bigger and gain greater reputation and sort of legitimacy, I suppose. But how international cricket fits in among these different leagues is going to be difficult. And I think a lot of, or how that happens will depend on what we were referring to before about the IPL itself and how the other T20 leagues sort of work out and how they grow.
Yeah, we talk about this in the book. So we interviewed Tom Harrison, who's the CEO of the ECB, and he talks about this anomaly at the moment. You have context in ODI cricket with the ODI League, you have context in bilateral Test cricket with the World Test Championship, and you have nothing in the most popular format of the game, T20. And he says this is a priority to introduce something. So you either do that by doing a kind of more all-encompassing structure of qualifying for the World Cup, sort of every team having to enter potentially. Which would be one very interesting model. The other one I think could work very well is in football. They've introduced the Nations League recently, which basically has kind of groups of 4, promotion and relegation, very short, sharp. And the beauty of T20 is you could do that event in a week. So you could have 4 teams. They come to India or they come to England. They plays each other twice. That's six matches each, maybe in 10 days realistically. And then the top team goes to like the grand final at the end of the year, every 2 years, whatever the cycle is, and the bottom team is relegated to the pool below, and then they have the opportunity to rise and fall again. That something like that would work really well, because there is sometimes a slightly hollow feeling going to international T20. This should be a really, really big deal, and you go there, you see quite a lot of guys rested, and it's a bit, players are out of sync, and it's a bit weird. And that lag between the World Cup, which we saw the last one in India, T20 World Cup, had so much riding on it, and the quality of cricket was absolutely fantastic. And then normal internationals often so half-hearted in comparison with that. I think that will be something that the administrators, they need to address that, because if they don't, actually, we're going to see an acceleration of what we're already, this big trend we're already seeing in cricket, which is the rise of club cricket and the comparative decrease in international cricket. So one of these incredible stats we found is that before the IPL, the commercial value of domestic cricket in India was only literally about 1 or 2% of the total value of broadcasting rights for cricket matches in India. This is just in India, not ICC events. Now it's 71% thanks to the IPL. And that gives an extent of the shift we've seen, and also probably the journey that we're still on.
What makes a good T20 player? Do you want to take this, Tim?
Yeah, sure. I think the first and most important thing is to think of T20 as a separate sport, to not think of it as a shorter ODI or let alone a shorter Test match, but to think of it as specific. And it's about doing specific roles and doing the better than anyone else. And so Andre Russell, I think we could all agree, is probably the MVP of T20. What's so good about him? I suppose his hitting ability is unrivaled and incredible. He's versatile in when he can come out, but he tends to play in a fairly similar way. But he's also got a kind of a smartness to it about when he decides to attack. But I mean, it goes back to incredible at clearing the ropes. He's also a phenomenal fielder, and he's a very useful bowler. And he's a bowler who can bowl all 3 phases, which is very, very, very valuable. So you add up together, and he's a prototype of a T20 cricketer. And I suppose his stardom has overwhelmingly come through his brilliance in leagues rather than in international cricket. And to go back to your earlier question, what makes a T20? I think. As good as he is, and as kind of well regarded as he is, I think in the years to come, him or someone like him will get a little bit more kind of sporting respect than he does at the moment. I mean, he still gets a lot, but maybe the time will come when we recognise him and he's embraced as a giant in the same way that, say, Kane Williamson is in a very different way. And not so much in T20, but we will come to respect, and I think we should respect the skills of an Andre Russell as being equal to of a Kane Williamson. They're very different, incredible in very different ways, but I don't think one is inferior to the other.
Freddie, is there a realization in the people you guys speak to about the idea that power is basically the holy grail in the T20 game, especially on the batting side?
Power is central to T20 batting, but I don't think it's the only thing. I think there is still space in the game for a little, probably one player per team, I think. I think of him as I increasingly work now alongside teams, and Tim earlier was saying how there are sort of two conversations going on, one in the media and one in teams, and working in teams is sort of has shone light on this for me. I think. And the way that I think of it is, I think there is probably always going to be a space for a kind of like firewall batsman who probably will increasingly float down up and down the order. And if you are 20 for 3, then you might send that player in, and he probably is in the mould of a Virat Kohli or a Kane Williamson. Mm-hmm. But apart from him, there is an emphasis on power, the ability to clear the ropes, particularly hit sixes rather than hit fours. And score boundaries rather than run. It is the most essential thing. You've written in depth about this, and you're completely right. The currency of the game, it runs, and the way that the runs are scored means that taking risks to try and hit boundaries is worthwhile. You've written as well about how teams aren't often bowled out, and that batsmen should generally be more risky or more aggressive in their approach. And I think that's going to lead to power will continue to be prioritised. And I think also what we've seen in the first generation of T20 is that players have been trying to bridge formats. So guys have been trying to adapt games for Test match cricket and then play T20 cricket. But as we see players specialize more, I think we'll just simply see an acceleration of the skills which we already see to be valuable. So power, the ability to score 360 degrees, those two things I think are central to T20 batting, and I think in the next 10 to 15 years we're going to only see that the emphasis placed on them increase.
And in terms of what makes a good play, and one of the things we talked with Brendan McCullum, and he said it's so difficult for players, brilliant batsmen, to just basically to retrain everything they've ever known about cricket and to learn to value their wicket less highly. That is such a difficult thing to do, and it's proved so difficult for so many brilliant players. But now we are seeing a generation who maybe they grew up and they actually wanted to be a T20 cricketer as much as anything else. So they didn't think of T20 as a format you play along with the others. You get kids now who grew up and their aim is to be the best T20 cricketer that they can be. And they might still want to play the other formats, but if their primary aim is that T20 cricket and to be as good as they possibly can, then it means that their whole mindset and their whole way of being will be around that. And actually, this links to analytics and data, because historically a problem of the way that teams have recruited players is they've simply looked too much at the top line numbers, which is how many runs does someone score. So someone playing in a very selfless way, who is going to fail more naturally as part of that, that they would be insecure about playing in that way because they could be dropped or they could not get gigs in other leagues. But as teams are learning to use the data in a better way, in a more rigorous way, one of the interesting things, it's encouraging them to be more attacking because they are learning. There is no point in doing what Ajinkya Rahane, and I have nothing against him, did against West Indies in that semi-final in 2016 when he gets 40 or 35 balls. They get to 190 for 2 and they're actually beaten very easily because they haven't scored enough runs. That sort of innings, it will become less common because teams will realise the value in going earlier, and that a lot of it comes from something very innate in the batsman's mindset, and that's why it might be it's a younger generation can reach new heights. And maybe it's revealing that we talk of Andre Russell, because although he's a different generation to the young players now, he has been someone who T20 has always really been the pinnacle for him.
Sorry, although he when he was growing up, so how old is Russell? He's probably mid to late 20s. Actually, in fact, I think he might be approaching 30 now. He when he grew up, T20 was only just starting. There will be guys who are growing up now in the Caribbean where T20 is a massive thing, and they're going to be, it's a frightening thought, but they're going to be even more emphasis. There's going to be even more emphasis for them on power. Like it's going to be, you talk about the approach of batsmen being sort of like hardwired into their brain to value their wicket. When Russell grew up, I'm sure he played cricket and he valued his wicket. But there will be kids now who are growing up and they don't, or they won't, or not to certainly the same degree that the guys who play first class cricket or are bred on longer forms of cricket do. And that's an amazing thought, really, that we're only scratching the surface. I think from a psychological standpoint, I think the game has changed massively, technically, massively, and I don't think there'll be many more advancements in the way that the shots that are played from a technical standpoint, because I think we've sort of basically done all that they can do in many ways. But I think the mind is the thing that will continue to change and continue to sort of reap massive changes in the way that batting is approached over the coming years.
Players have tried to sort of make that shift in setup and approach. KL Rahul comes to mind, and it has messed up his long form game quite a bit. He's a very different long form player in the last, say, 12 months compared to what he was when he started, 4 years ago. And players have really struggled to adapt. And most players who continue to remain successful in the long form game have just not made a big enough shift. With the exception of maybe AB de Villiers, who's something of a freak of nature, I can't think of a second batsman who's successfully able to hit in T20 and bat in Test cricket.
David Warner is perhaps the only other player I can think of who's maybe done it, but he's not a hitter. You're right. Warner anchors the innings in a way, and he doesn't hit in the way that Russell and de Villiers do. You're right. I think that the fact is the games are diverging. The skills are becoming more and more different.
David
and as a result,
seems to be more of an 80 and 50 man rather than say a 40 and 15 man.
Yeah. Completely, There's a slight, you're right. There's a slight difference there, and I don't think, de Villiers is the only one. I think, de Villiers is, as far as I'm concerned, one of the most talented players, certainly that I've ever watched, and I think he's one of the greatest players ever to play the game, simply because of his ability to transfer those skills across formats so effectively. And I think we'll see greater specialisation, particularly in batting, but I think also in bowling, because the games just aren't the same. Test cricket and T20 cricket are, and we talk about this in the book, and you've written it as well many times, they should be considered as different sports.
So, Tim, Anil Kumble developed a googly around the turn of the century, and then, he broke his arm, but he later used it well in Australia. And he was asked about it, and he said, well, I know the batsmen read the googly, but they still have to play it. The premise in Test cricket is that there are no secrets, there are no mysteries. There's so much time that the mysteries get found out. And one of the things that struck me in your book, the key to being a great spinner in T20 is the ability to keep the batsman guessing about what's happening off the pitch. So I've been trying to make sense of how to think about bowling in T20, and that was, it seems to me, quite an insight. Can you sort of elaborate on that a little bit?
It was Carl Crowe, Carl Crowe is a specialist spin coach, and again, we talked about something we'll see more of. We'll be more specialization of players, and certainly much more of coaches as well. So Carl Crowe, who's basically the mentor and coach for Sunil Narayan, and has done a huge amount of work with him. He says, it's all about you cannot allow batsmen to set themselves up. So it is about being that step ahead of the batsman. So that goes back a bit to that famous quote from Ravi Ashwin. When he says, maybe 6 bad balls is how to construct a good over in T20, and that does recognise a very, very salient fact, and that completely contrasts with Test cricket, which, as Jason Gillespie tells us, that is the war of attrition. It's about who wins that spot just outside the off stump. If you do that, you're winning the game. T20 is completely different, and what we think of as a bad ball can be a good ball, and vice versa. So this is the way we think about it. It needs to be completely different, because it is, and I suppose bowling at the death is a good example of this, because it is so much about being unpredictable, but it's also about being able to nail particular things at times. But this was with the Yorker at the death. Everyone always says, "Oh, why isn't it bowled more?" and so on. Well, the reason it's not is because its margin for error is so small, and also if batsmen learn to read it and set themselves for it, they can make it into a low full toss and hit and club that away. So the kind of game theory of how to bat and bowl in in T20 cricket. I think we'll see academic papers on that, just as we see them on how to take a penalty in a penalty shootout. There's probably some parallels with death bowling and penalty shootouts.
For me, just one technical point that I think comes through about not only spin bowling but fast bowling as well is you talk about Jason Gillespie, saying Test cricket is a battle for that spot outside off stump. For me, from what I've gathered, and I picked this up quite a lot with the work I've done with teams, bowling in T20 cricket is very much about cramping. I think line is very, very important, more important than length. It's about cramping people for room, not giving them the ability to free their arms. It's that swing of the arms, which comes from essentially batsmen can sometimes move around the crease and create a line, if you like, or open up a side of the field. But the control of line is massive, and Narayan is amazing at this. And I think it applies to spinners and fast bowlers. Jofra Archer's another one who stands out, who basically gives the batsman no room. It's about room to free your arms, and for me, that's the way I think often about T20 bowling, is about cramping people and keeping that sort of tight channel line, or not quite channel. Sometimes it's even tighter than that. And that's I think something that really comes through as being essential to T20 bowling.
And I have one more question on this subject, and then we can conclude.
Sure.
And this is that, when I interviewed Zubin Barucha all those 6-7 years ago, there was this idea, a nascent idea at that time, about teams pursuing sort of favorable matchups. So they would, if they saw that the opposition had held back its spinner, then they would hold back their player who they thought was, their best bet to, smash the spinner out of the ground, basically. How does the relationship between sort of the coaching staff and the team captain and the team dugout, how does that develop, in this type of situation where, the tactical situation is developing every over?
I think there are different ways of going about it. Different captains and different coaches will have different relationships and different dynamics. So I think one person we spoke to for the book, Ricky Ponting, is a coach who's particularly hands-on. His captain in the IPL is Shreyas Iyer, a young, probably quite impressionable young captain. And I think it's very much Ponting's team, whereas you can contrast that with Chennai, which is very much Dhoni's team. And you'll see, I think there are different dynamics depending on the different individuals, but generally speaking, I think we'll see a greater emphasis on the backroom staff and the strategizing done by the team analyst and by the coach, simply because I think Dhoni is a remarkable captain because he does a lot of those calculations in his head. We talk about this in one of the chapters. We look at the difference between Kohli the captain and Dhoni the captain, and Dhoni's ability to read the game is unparalleled. I think he can quite clearly be probably the greatest limited overs captain of all time, simply because of his ability to understand what is required at any given moment. He's done it for so long that it can't be luck or anything like that. There is an innate skill there. But I think as the game becomes more led by data, and guys like Dhoni don't come around very often, and I think as a result we'll see a greater emphasis placed on the coach and the strategists in the dugout. And we see strategic timeouts in the IPL. I think there'll be more of that kind of involvement from the sidelines, because I don't think captains can't simply do all these calculations in their head. And I think that's why, there's going to be a greater emphasis on the backroom strategizing.
And it's incredibly how until very, very recently, and in some cases still now, the recruitment of coaches has been completely in the dark ages. So the best example of this is probably with Daniel Vettori, who, if you look at him and you hear him speak, he's extremely impressive. He played the game T20 very well at the end of his career. He's got glasses. He ticks every box. You just by the eye test, you think he must be a really, really good coach. But we still don't have a simple way of getting, like Crickinfo has so many stats for players, but they don't have ones for coaches. So actually getting the win-loss record of coaches can be incredibly difficult. We see, and actually turns out that Dan Vettori, he's basically lost more games than he's won wherever he's gone, which, given that T20 leagues are set up to ensure competitive balance, that's of a big enough sample, that suggests he's not a brilliant coach. And so with Middlesex, they appointed him before 2017, and they just said, the main reason, basically, they said, he's got this IPL experience. It shows what a good coach he is. So you have this sort of halo effect from the IPL. But then turns out he did terribly there. He won 7 games out of 27. But the point is, I think we will see coaches become more accountable, and we'll see a bit like we have in football. We'll get articles saying who will be the next IPL coach to be sacked. We'll get more mid-season sackings and stuff. And that, maybe less desirable in some ways, but it will mean teams are more accountable. And again, there's more of an emphasis on winning and losing, and that becomes really, really even more important. I mean, that will certainly happen.
Because in sort of T20 is sort of hampered by sort of the cricketing tradition and this subject, isn't it? Where, the coaches, in Ian Chappell's famous words, something which drives you to the ground and then back to the hotel. Because I interviewed John Buchanan about 8 or 9 years ago, and he told me about a couple of cases where, the players were just not receptive to that kind of micromanagement on a sort of ball by ball, over by over basis. Because one of the things he said is that with all this data, it is possible to measure whether, the player actually executed what was expected and separate that out from whether or not the outcome was what was desired and so on. So he was telling me about this issue of accountability, and he said players are given their cricketing histories. They are not yet receptive to that. But do you think that's just a generational thing, or is there something deeper there?
I think it's generational. I think it will take time, but I think the proof will be in that when used properly, data and micromanagement, if you want to call it that, of players will and should lead to improved results. And I think that will be the evidence that players need to embrace it more wholeheartedly. And I think they'll recognise that if they, if a batsman understands his negative and positive matchups, he's more likely to succeed and he's more likely to earn more money. And I think that ultimately will be the reason that players become more accepting of it. I think over time that will happen. There's always going to be a difficulty in essentially telling professional sportsmen how to do their job. But that's the job, that's the job of the team analyst and of the coach to sort of try and convey the message in a way that's understood and accepted. But I think that, as I said, I think the fact that they'll perform better if they listen generally, I think will mean that they will listen.
And as the control of players increases, and players get long-term contracts and stuff, so the incentives for teams to actually invest in improving their players rather than just identifying players, that will increase massively. Because if you can give a player 4 or 5 year contract, then you can really think about how to make him a better player. At the moment, I think most overwhelmingly analytics in cricket when it comes to players has been used much more to identify undervalued players, which has been very good at often, as opposed to explain to a player how they can get better and work with them to get better. And that goes back to the control issues that we talked about with seasons being so short and players fitting in and out. And I think as that begins to go, you'll see, as it begins to change, we're beginning to see that again with the KKR a bit. But we will see, players will have basically our personalised coaches who work with their franchises, and that will all be geared to working on specific things to actually, maybe the inefficiency is going to be less in recruitment and the opportunity will be less in recruiting smarter than your rivals, but in developing your players better than your rivals.
This has been very interesting. There's a lot more we could talk about over here. I heartily recommend the book to listeners. It is the first real survey review of this new sport which has emerged, or this new sport which is trying to emerge from under cricket's massive shadow, having come to life, as a sort of a, how should I describe it, Freddie?
As an abridged version of the longer format of the game.
Yeah.
And then I guess it is emerging from cricket's shadow, and I think we'll see more of that over the coming years.
Tim, do you have any final words for our listeners?
Most importantly, to buy the book, which is that is a really, really important thing. And you can buy it around the world. if not on hardback, then always in Kindle form. And yeah, we put a lot into this. We've had exclusive interviews with over 80, players and coaches and stuff. And we really feel that, yeah, we've put so much into this, and we've hopefully given you a little hint on this podcast. So yeah, we'd love if we could share it with you.
I recommend the book, and I second everything Tim just said heartily. On that note, Tim Wigmore, Freddie Wilde, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. It's been great to chat.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure.